A reservoir built to hold 2 million acre-feet dropped to 1.4% full, 27,000 acre-feet, in a basin built in 1915 to guarantee water for a desert city. The water near the dam is 170 feet deep, so it looks full from above. Officials call this drought. That's true, but not the full answer. Underneath sits a 13-year lawsuit over how this water gets divided between states, fought over for years at the Supreme Court. So the question to ask is this reservoir empty because the rain didn't come, or because the water got lost in a legal fight? I work with water systems and allocation data for a living, and I want to say something up front. I am not shocked this happened. I am shocked that people keep pretending this was a surprise. Let's start with the number again, because it deserves a second look. 1.4% full. That was July 28th, 2026. A week before that, it was 1.8%. A month before that, June 28th, it was 4.1%. 3 months before that, late April, it was 12.8%. Read that sequence out loud and tell me that looks like weather. Weather is noisy. Weather goes up and down. This isn't noisy. This is a straight line falling in one direction, month after month, like something with a shape to it. And when I see a shape like that, my first question isn't, how bad is the drought? My first question is, what is actually controlling this number? Because a drought explains why less water came in. It does not automatically explain why the system can't hold on to what it has. So here's the official version, the one you'll hear in most local coverage. Officials from the Bureau of Reclamation say the low water reflects a long drought across the Southwest, now in its third decade. They also say the dam itself is structurally fine, no safety concerns at current levels. Both of those things can be true, and neither of them is the actual question people should be asking. Nobody serious is worried the concrete is going to fail. The question is why a system engineered specifically to guarantee water to a desert city keeps arriving at nearly empty, faster each time, and why the fix has never been, here's how we stop this from happening again. It's always, here's how we're managing the emergency this time. That's the part that bothers me professionally. Emergency management is not a substitute for a plan, and this system has been running on emergency management since before some of you were born. Let me explain why the visual is lying to you a little, because this matters before we go any further. A reservoir like this isn't a bowl with flat, even water across the whole surface. It's more like an enormous bathtub carved into a valley, deep near the dam wall and shallow everywhere else. When storage drops, the shallow edges are the first to go dry and expose lake bed, while the deep pool near the dam can still hold water for a long time after the rest of the basin has essentially given up. That's why photos from this drought and photos from a full year can look deceptively similar from a distance if the shot is framed toward the dam. The shallow water that dried up first is exactly the water that would have evaporated fastest anyway, because shallow water heats fast in direct desert sun, and warm water evaporates faster than cool water sitting deep and shaded. None of that is exotic science. It's just what water does. But it means the visible collapse of this reservoir has been happening in stages, at the edges first, for years, before the headline number finally caught up to what the shoreline was already showing anyone paying attention. Let me back up, because you need the shape of this thing before the twist makes sense. Elephant Butte Dam went up in 1915. It's not new infrastructure improvising against a modern drought. It is more than 100 years old, built specifically to store Rio Grande water and guarantee irrigation and municipal supply downstream all the way to El Paso, Texas. At full capacity, the reservoir behind it holds close to 2.2 million acre-feet. For scale, an acre-foot is roughly enough water to cover a football field 1 foot deep. So we're talking about a basin engineered to be one of the largest water reserves in the American Southwest. In 1938, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas signed something called the Rio Grande Compact. This is the document everyone points to when they explain why El Paso is supposed to get water. It divides the river's flow between the states, based roughly on the irrigable acreage each one had in the Rio Grande project at the time, something like 57% to New Mexico and 43% to Texas. Sounds clean, sounds settled. It is not settled. And here's where the story stops being about weather. Colorado is technically part of this compact too, delivering water at the state line into New Mexico before any of it ever reaches Elephant Butte. So in theory, you've got a clean three-state relay. Colorado delivers to New Mexico stores and delivers to the reservoir delivers to Texas, and, by extension, to El Paso, and to farmers on both sides of that state line. Relay races work fine on paper. They fall apart the moment one leg of the handoff quietly keeps some of the water for itself before passing the baton. And that's essentially what Texas spent over a decade in court arguing had been happening. The compact's numbers were never actually run off pure 1938 conditions. The operating math that's been used for decades is based on something called the D2 data period, a stretch of years from 1951 to 1978. And here's the detail I want you to sit with. That exact window is when groundwater pumping in southern New Mexico was already climbing. So, the formula everyone treats as the neutral, historical baseline was built during the years the underlying problem was already happening. That's not a footnote. That's the entire case sitting quietly inside a technical acronym nobody outside a courtroom ever hears. Okay, here's where the mechanism actually matters, because this is the part most coverage skips past in one sentence. Groundwater and river water are not two separate systems that happen to sit near each other. In an alluvial valley like the stretch between Elephant Butte and the Texas state line, they're connected. Pump water out of the ground near a river, and you don't just take groundwater. You pull the river's own water sideways into the aquifer to replace what you removed. The river effectively feeds the well. So you can have a reservoir sitting at a reasonable level upstream, water technically released on schedule, and still have less of it actually reach Texas, because a good chunk of it got intercepted underground before it ever crossed the line. The dam isn't the choke point. The soil between the dam and the city is. Here's the part I'd want you to actually picture, not just hear. Drill a well close enough to a river and pump it hard enough, and you create what people in my field call a cone of depression, a dip in the water table that spreads outward from the well like a funnel. If that funnel reaches under the riverbed, the river starts losing water into the ground to fill it. The same way a straw pulls a milkshake toward wherever the suction is strongest. The river upstream can look completely normal. The gauge at the reservoir can show a completely normal release. And downstream, less water arrives anyway. Not because anyone stole it in the traditional sense, but because physics moved it sideways before it ever got counted. That's a genuinely hard thing to police, because it doesn't show up as a dramatic diversion canal or a locked gate. It shows up as a slow, quiet, technically legal until it isn't drawdown spread across hundreds of wells over decades. That's the allegation that sat at the center of a lawsuit Texas filed against New Mexico back in 2013. Texas argued that groundwater pumping in southern New Mexico had been quietly draining water that the compact legally owed to Texas, before that water could ever reach the river channel where anyone was counting it. 13 years of litigation. Let that number sit there for a second, because it's going to come back. Now, before I get to the legal mess, I want to show you the historical pattern, because this is not the first time this reservoir has gone nearly dry, and the recurrence is its own piece of evidence. 1972 was the last comparable benchmark before the modern era, a genuine multi-decade low following droughts in the 50s and 60s. Then, in the summer of 2013, the reservoir dropped to about 3% capacity, 65,057 acre-feet, according to Army Corps of Engineers figures at the time. That was the lowest it had been in over 40 years. In August 2022, it fell under 4% again. This June 2026, it was at 5.6% and dropping, with managers openly worried it could hit 2%, and now we're sitting at 1.4%, in territory that some reporting puts near or below the 55-year low mark, with one estimate citing storage around 32,000 acre-feet during that stretch. Here's where I'd start asking annoying questions if I were sitting in that agency's office. If the physical decline has been this visible, this repeatable, this documented since at least the early 2010s, why did it take until 2024 for the actual water rights dispute underneath it to blow up at the US Supreme Court? Because that's exactly what happened. Texas sued New Mexico in 2013 over the groundwater issue. The federal government was allowed to intervene in 2019 because the reservoir and the delivery system are federally operated, and Washington had its own interest in how the water gets divided. In 2022, Texas and New Mexico worked out a settlement between themselves. Sounds like the end of the story, right? It wasn't. In June 2024, the Supreme Court rejected that settlement, 5-4, ruling that the deal unfairly cut the federal government's own interests out of the agreement. Back to the table. A new settlement got drafted in 2025, this time involving the Department of Justice directly, along with the irrigation districts on both sides. And in 2026, the Supreme Court issued a final consent decree. When the Supreme Court finally approved the underlying compact framework in this latest round, Texas's outgoing Attorney General at the time called it a historic win for Texas, its economy, and the state's water rights, and said the agreement would help Texas farmers and families get the water they depend on every day. I want to be precise here, because language like that is doing a lot of quiet work. Calling a 13-year legal settlement a historic win is not the same statement as the reservoir is now reliably full, or the underlying groundwater mechanism has been fixed. One is a legal victory lap. The other is a physical fact about water in a basin. Those two things get talked about in the same breath constantly in coverage like this, and they are not the same claim. A courtroom can absolutely resolve who is legally entitled to water without resolving whether that water is physically going to show up. So walk through that timeline with me. 2013 to 2026. 13 years. A lawsuit that outlived multiple state administrations and, according to reporting on the case, cost taxpayers tens of millions of dollars just in legal proceedings, before you even get to the water itself. And what did all of that produce? An agreement that still measures delivery using accounting built around that 1951 to 1978 period, just now applied against a river system in a climate nobody in 1978 was planning for. I want to be fair here. The new decree reportedly shifts part of the measurement point toward El Paso itself, which is supposed to protect Texas better than measuring only at the state line. That's a real, meaningful change. But here's my actual question, and it's not a rhetorical one. Does moving the ruler fix the fact that water can still disappear into the ground before it ever reaches that ruler? As of this recording, I have not seen the final decree's technical delivery formula broken down publicly in enough detail to answer that with confidence. That's not me being evasive. That's a genuine, unresolved variable. And I'd rather tell you it's unresolved than pretend I know the answer. This is the part I don't hear enough people saying plainly. You can win an entire legal argument about where you measure the water and still lose the actual water if the physical mechanism that was draining it hasn't changed. And there's a layer to this most domestic coverage skips entirely. Elephant Butte isn't just a Texas versus New Mexico story. Mexico also has a legal claim on water released downstream through Caballo Dam, below Elephant Butte, under a separate international agreement governing the Rio Grande. In recent seasons, Mexico's call for water releases has ended around the same window that the El Paso County Water Improvement District winds down its own irrigation call, meaning the reservoir isn't just splitting water between two American states, it's part of a three-way international obligation running through the same shrinking pool. Every gallon that disappears into a cone of depression before it ever reaches the reservoir is a gallon that three separate legal claimants, not two, are technically owed a share of. That doesn't get simpler under pressure. It gets more fragile. Look at that list again. 1972, 2013, 2022, 2026. That's not one freak year. That's a system arriving at crisis on a shorter and shorter cycle, each time a little lower than before. If this were purely rainfall variability, you'd expect randomness. What you're looking at instead is a trend, and trends have causes, not just triggers. Now here's a twist that I think gets skipped over almost every time this story gets covered, and it's the one that actually worries me the most professionally. El Paso's answer to an unreliable Rio Grande has been to diversify. New wells drilled into underground aquifers, expanded desalination capacity, treating brackish groundwater into usable supply, especially since the severe shortages of the early 2010s pushed the city hard in that direction. On paper, that's smart risk management. You don't want one single fragile source. But sit with the mechanism I explained earlier for a second. The entire lawsuit, the entire 13-year fight, was about groundwater pumping near the river, pulling surface water sideways out of the system before it could be delivered and counted properly. So when the city's own hedge against an unreliable surface water compact is to lean harder on groundwater wells, you have to ask whether that's solving the problem or quietly feeding the exact mechanism the lawsuit was fighting about in the first place. That's not an accusation of bad faith. Cities have to survive short-term shortages with the tools available to them, but it is a legitimate technology fit question. A well is a legitimate tool. Whether leaning on it here solves the underlying supply problem or just moves the same water fight underground and out of public view is a different question entirely, and I haven't seen it answered. I'll be honest with you about something else, because pretending I have every number would be dishonest. I don't have current verified figures in front of me for exactly how much desalination capacity El Paso is running today, or exactly how many new wells have gone in since the worst of the 2013 shortage. That's a real gap, and it's the kind of gap that should exist in a public dashboard somewhere, updated in real time, not buried across a decade of scattered agency statements. If a city's entire drought resilience plan depends on groundwater pumping, and groundwater pumping is the exact mechanism at the center of a 13-year interstate lawsuit, the public deserves an easy answer to how much are we currently pumping and where. I don't think that number should be hard to find. Right now, functionally, it is. I want to name the monitoring gap directly because this is the theme running under everything I've just told you. The compact's entire enforcement structure depends on where and how you measure water, and that measurement point has moved, been litigated, been rejected by the Supreme Court, and been renegotiated multiple times across more than a decade. Every time the measurement changes, the legal answer to who has the water can change, even if the actual physical water situation on the ground hasn't moved an inch. That should bother you. It bothers me. Good water management runs on baseline data collected before the crisis, not accounting formulas argued over after the reservoir is already at 1.4%. Think about what a properly monitored version of this system would actually look like. Real-time groundwater metering across the wells in that stretch between the dam and the state line. A shared public accounting of pumping volumes updated continuously instead of reconstructed years later in a courtroom. Independent verification of how much river water is genuinely being lost to lateral seepage versus how much is simply evaporating off a shallow, overheated surface. None of that requires new science. All of that technology already exists and is used in plenty of other river basins. What's been missing here isn't the tools. It's the political will to install a system that can't be argued with, because an unarguable number doesn't leave room for a 13-year lawsuit. And I think that's worth sitting with for a second, because it means nobody with the power to fix the ambiguity had a strong incentive to close it. Let's talk about who actually lives inside this number, because it's easy to treat 1.4% as an abstraction. Nearly half the population of El Paso depends on the system for part of its water supply, according to reporting going back over a decade. That's not a small regional footnote. That's a major American city with its water security tied to a lawsuit that took 13 years to settle. Meanwhile, farmers on the New Mexico side have been dealing with some of the shortest irrigation seasons on record, and when the river water isn't there, the fallback is often groundwater that can be salty enough to damage crops and land over time if you rely on it too long. Recreation economies built around the lake have taken a direct hit too. Boat ramps have become hazardous as water pulls back and exposes sediment and debris. One marina operator described the conditions bluntly, saying it's the worst he's ever seen it, that people are tearing up their boats and their props on newly exposed hazards that weren't there a few years ago. That's not abstract economic language. That's a guy watching his literal livelihood sit on dry lake bed that used to be underwater. And it isn't only recreation. Park crews have had to work daily just to keep a single boat ramp usable, clearing sediment and debris left behind as the shoreline pulls back week over week. Four-wheel drive has gone from a suggestion to something close to a requirement just to get a trailer to the water's edge. That's the physical, on-the-ground version of a percentage point most people will only ever see as a headline number. A statistic like 1.4% doesn't tell you about a boat prop getting shredded on a sandbar that wasn't there 2 summers ago. It doesn't tell you about a farmer deciding whether a tree in his yard survives the season on a garden hose because there's no river water to irrigate with at all. The number is real. It's just not the whole story, and it was never going to be, because percentages are what you get after everyone downstream has already adjusted their entire lives around them. And here's the detail that still gets me. Even at 1.4%, even at what looks like a near-empty reservoir from a satellite photo, the deepest water near the dam is still reported at around 170 feet. The lake is not actually flat and dry. It's a puddle sitting inside an enormous bathtub, deep in the middle, nearly empty everywhere else. From above, especially in photos, it can still look like there's plenty of water there. That visual gap between looks fine from a distance and is functionally a fraction of its design capacity is exactly the kind of thing that lets an emergency get quietly normalized for years before anyone treats it like the structural problem it actually is. So what would a competent water manager have flagged decades ago before any of this became a Supreme Court case? Simple. An enforcement mechanism that depends on a moving legal definition of where and how you count water is not a management plan. It's a permanent argument dressed up as an agreement. You don't build multi-generational promises to a desert city on top of an allocation formula that still hasn't been fully, stably agreed upon since 1938. That's not weather. That's not bad luck. That's a design flaw in how this water gets legally allocated and measured, and a legal design flaw does not stay abstract forever. Eventually, the physical reservoir is the one that pays for it. The reservoir just runs out, and the lawsuit becomes the headline instead of the footnote. Here's what I keep coming back to. The dam was never actually the bottleneck. The concrete has been fine this whole time. Officials are right about that part. The bottleneck has always been the definition of whose water this is, argued over in courtrooms while the actual river kept doing exactly what water does under drought, heat, and demand. Right now, tonight, the reservoir is still sitting at a record low. The aquifer underneath the valley is still being pumped. And the newest consent decree, the one that took 13 years and multiple failed attempts to produce, still has to survive contact with the next real drought before anyone can honestly call this settled. The water didn't vanish because nobody understood the physics. Shallow water heats fast, still water evaporates, groundwater pulls river water sideways, and none of that is a mystery to anyone who's worked in this field for more than a week. The water disappeared because for 13 years, more attention went into arguing over who legally owned it than into tracking where it was actually going underground. And a river doesn't wait for anyone to finish that argument before it decides how much of itself is left.